There's a strange irony in the way Hollywood handles stories that go too far, not too far in violence, not in language, but in imagination, in truth. When a film dares to push science fiction into uncomfortable territory, when it stops being about space battles and becomes about identity, surveillance, or the collapse of reality itself, it's no longer just entertainment. It becomes a threat. And threats, in Hollywood, are often dealt with quietly. In the late 20th century, a peculiar pattern emerged. Films with deeply speculative ideas were released under different banners: drama, mystery, romance, even satire. The science fiction label was erased not because it didn't apply, but because it hit too close to something real, something not everyone wanted to name. These weren't accidents in categorization, they were choices. Calculated rebrandings designed to dull the impact, to make us feel safer in the face of unsettling possibilities. But genres are only skin. Strip them away, and the core remains. This is Vaulted Futures, and what you're about to see isn't just a list of forgotten sci-fi. It's a map of warnings that were camouflaged and nearly buried. 1. Stalker, 1979. They call it the zone. It has no rules. Or maybe it has rules too complex for humans to understand. In the center, there's a room. And in that room, your deepest desire becomes reality whether you want it to or not. Stalker is a journey through ruined landscapes and quiet dread. A scientist, a writer, and their guide. Each one carrying motives they barely admit. As they move deeper, the space around them becomes alive, not with monsters, but with decisions. Delayed, waited, observed. When it was exported, distributors avoided the label science fiction. Too abstract, too slow, too spiritual. But Stalker is sci-fi at its most honest. Not about tools, but about thresholds. Not about technology, but about consequence. The zone is not dangerous because it kills. It's dangerous because it gives you exactly what you've asked for, even if you lied to yourself about what that was. 2. Dead Ringers, 1988. Two minds, one body of thought. Identical in form, but drifting in purpose. In Dead Ringers, twin doctors push their knowledge beyond what flesh should allow and discover that invention without boundaries becomes something else entirely. They craft new instruments, tools that are elegant, alien, and wrong. Not for healing, not even for harm, but for exploring imagined anomalies that exist only in their obsession. This isn't science as progress, it's science as descent. The film was marketed as psychological drama. The horror was placed in the mind, not in the clinic. But behind the surgical gowns is a pure speculative horror. What happens when technology is born from delusion rather than discovery? Dead Ringers is not about madness. It's about genius collapsing under its own precision. 3. Solaris, 1972. Above a planet that thinks, a man confronts something more terrifying than aliens, himself. Solaris doesn't offer spectacle, it offers reflection, sharpened until it cuts. The planet does not speak, but it listens, it observes, and then it returns what it finds. A woman who should be dead, a memory that shouldn't have weight. A guilt too intimate to be touched becomes flesh. The science here is not in the machinery, it's in the implication that the universe doesn't need weapons to destroy us. It only needs to show us what we've hidden from ourselves. When it came west, Solaris was sold as philosophy, not fiction. A quiet, intellectual answer to louder American space operas. The marketing avoided the word science, let alone speculative. But make no mistake, this is science fiction in its most distilled form. Not fiction about space. Fiction about what space does to the human soul. 4. The Accidental Tourist, 1988. He catalogs the world for people who don't want to experience it. Guides written for travelers who prefer not to leave the comfort of their own preferences. The result is a life without risk. And without risk, something begins to erode. The Accidental Tourist is not presented as sci-fi. It's a meditation on grief, routine, and recovery. But quietly, beneath the polite monotony, is a portrait of emotional automation. The protagonist builds walls from details, routines, maps. Everything is organized to prevent unpredictability. But as the system becomes more efficient, so does the detachment. Early drafts of the story reportedly explored this further, suggesting a world where people outsource not only their travel, but their experience of life itself. In the final cut, much of that is buried, hidden under the award season gloss. But the implication remains. If we can eliminate surprise, What part of being human disappears with it? 5. The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976. He doesn't crash, he arrives, quietly, with knowledge no one asked for and a mission no one is ready to understand. In The Man Who Fell to Earth, an alien assumes a human identity to save his home planet. But instead of changing our world, he's consumed by it: corporate greed, human appetite, addiction masquerading as culture. His gifts are misused, his technology hijacked, his body, eventually, broken. Marketing focused on the strangeness, David Bowie's image, the fragmented storytelling. Few acknowledge that this was hard science fiction, told with art house tools. Studio executives leaned into the ambiguity, calling it allegory. Easier to sell alienation than to admit the film was asking, what happens when a superior intelligence places its trust in us and we betray it? This isn't a story about first contact, it's about first disappointment. 6. The Reflecting Skin, 1990. In a place where the sun never seems to blink, a child begins to notice that death doesn't arrive with thunder, it drifts in on dust and silence. The Reflecting Skin tells its story through golden wheat fields, pale faces, and a sky that seems too bright to trust. A boy suspects the widow down the road is a vampire. But that fantasy barely masks the darker reality. Something toxic is bleeding into this rural landscape, slowly unraveling bodies, minds, and innocence. Radiation is never named, contamination is never confirmed, but it lingers in every frame, like an invisible fog. The skin pales, the animals bloat, the people vanish. The horror isn't in what's shown, it's in what's suggested and ignored. Critics labeled it as surreal horror. Some called it a hallucination, but under the imagery lies a speculative warning. A poisoned world seen through the only eyes still uncorrupted. This isn't just a fable. It's the aftermath of something we never admitted happened. 7. The Truman Show, 1998. Truman wakes up each morning in a town where everything goes according to plan. The weather is perfect. The neighbors smile on cue. The world is small, manageable, and entirely manufactured. On paper, The Truman Show is satire, a commentary on media and modern isolation. But remove the comedy, and what remains is an experiment in artificial environment, surveillance embedded into architecture, lives built around predictive modeling. A man whose every movement is monitored, monetized, and managed. Paramount steered the narrative away from sci-fi. They feared the genre would make the truth too obvious. This was a simulation, not metaphorically, but literally. Truman's world is not a symbol, it's a product. His reality is curated, calculated, and broadcast. In hindsight, it's no longer speculative, it's foundational. Truman isn't living in a dystopia, he's just living 10 years ahead of the rest of us. 8. Ordinary People, 1980. Everything appears normal. A well-kept home, controlled conversations, a family working through loss. But the silence between their words stretches too long. The smiles crack a little too easily, and something begins to feel engineered. Ordinary People is remembered as an emotional drama, but watch it closely, and it plays like a closed experiment. Memories misalign. Emotional reactions play out with unnatural precision. Time loops, not visibly but emotionally, as if someone is resetting the script behind the scenes. This isn't just a story of grief, it's a simulation of grief. The more they try to express themselves, the more mechanical their responses become. The genre label was never applied, and yet the film behaves like speculative fiction wearing a mask of prestige cinema. What if this isn't a story about healing? What if it's a test to see how much pain a system can contain before something breaks? No. Jacob's Ladder, 1990. Jacob walks through a city he no longer recognizes. The streets flicker, the faces shift, time bleeds into itself, and every answer he chases fractures into more questions. Jacob's Ladder is a descent into the fog of memory, trauma, and something worse: manipulated perception. On the surface, it's a veteran struggling with grief, but beneath that surface is a different machinery, one designed to warp consciousness, test thresholds, and erase the line between hallucination and design. The studio avoided the label science fiction, pushing the film as psychological horror. But the deeper you go, the more clinical it feels. Government experimentation, chemical agents, the kind of testing that doesn't leave bruises, only rewired minds. Jacob isn't just haunted, he's altered. The world around him doesn't crumble because he's broken. It crumbles because it was never real to begin with. 10. The Rapture, 1991. She starts the film as a hedonist. She ends it staring into a sky that has opened. The Rapture doesn't flirt with apocalypse, it embraces it. It doesn't hint at judgment. It delivers it. With all its silence and terror intact, the transformation is gradual. The signs come slow, then all at once. What begins as spiritual doubt becomes certainty, terrible, unshakable certainty. And in the final act, the film crosses a line few dare approach. What if revelation is literal, not symbolic, not moral, but real? The studio sidestepped the sci-fi entirely, framing the story as a religious drama. But once heaven fractures the atmosphere and time ceases to behave, there's no denying what kind of story this really is. The Rapture dares to present a speculative end, not as metaphor, but as operating system. It's not asking what we believe, it's asking what happens when belief becomes infrastructure and the sky answers back. 11. Safe, 1995. Carol lives in a home so clean, it might be sterile. Her clothes are spotless, her smile is practiced, but her body is beginning to betray her. Scents, chemicals, the air itself, everything makes her sick. In Safe, illness becomes a mirror reflecting the invisible poisons of modern life. No clear cause, no agreed diagnosis. Her world doesn't respond with sympathy, only discomfort. As she deteriorates, she seeks refuge in isolation, retreating from a society that no longer feels survivable. The film was marketed as psychological drama, a character study. But there's something more chilling at play. A speculative scenario where humanity evolves into a species allergic to its own inventions. Pollution without gas masks, collapse without explosions. Safe whispers instead of shouts. But its vision is clear. The future won't arrive in sirens and fire. It will arrive slowly, silently, through every breath we take. 12. Brainstorm, 1983. A machine that records the full spectrum of human experience, not just sight and sound, but the feel of memory, the rush of emotion, the final seconds before death. In Brainstorm, the boundary between observer and subject dissolves into data. At first, the invention seems like wonder. Empathy becomes shareable. Experience becomes transferable. But wonder mutates quickly. The same device that can capture joy can also transmit fear, trauma, even oblivion. The moment death is recorded, the experiment crosses into something irreversible. The studio hesitated. Natalie Wood's sudden death during filming complicated the project, but so did the story itself. Marketing framed the film as a sleek thriller, with the sci-fi reduced to backdrop. There was little mention of the ethical questions it raised, or how closely it flirted with real-world military interest in neural manipulation. But Brainstorm saw it coming. Neural capture, experience as currency, the loss of psychological privacy. Today, it no longer looks like science fiction. It looks like a prototype we were warned not to build, and are building anyway. 13. The Lathe of Heaven, 1980. Each night, he dreams, and each morning, the world changes. Entire histories vanish, cities shift, people transform. But only one man remembers the version that came before. The Lathe of Heaven takes the most intimate act, dreaming, and turns it into a force of mass alteration. What begins as a gift becomes a burden. Those around him, especially those in power, see potential. But the more they intervene, the more the fabric of reality tears. When PBS released the film, they leaned away from its science fiction roots. They emphasized its quiet tone, its philosophical undercurrents. The visual effects were modest, the message enormous. But it was easier to shelve it as abstract drama than confront what it actually proposed. Because The Lathe of Heaven doesn't just ask, what if dreams could change reality? It asks, what happens when one man's idea of peace is forced on the entire world? 14. The Swimmer, 1968. A man in swim trunks strolls through the backyards of his wealthy neighbors, using their pools as stepping stones to get home. At first, it feels playful, quirky. But as the sun moves and the air shifts, reality begins to bend around him. Time slips, seasons change mid-sentence, conversations rewind and unravel. The swimmer moves like a dream you forget as you wake up, familiar and off-kilter all at once. It's a tale of memory distortion and emotional collapse told through chlorinated water and forced smiles. The studio called it drama, maybe even surrealism. But what it truly explored was the collapse of linear time, the fluidity of self-perception, and a reality subtly rewritten with each encounter. It behaves like science fiction in disguise, so softly woven into character that most viewers didn't see it coming. Looking back, it's clear. The Swimmer isn't just about a man swimming home. It's about a world folding in on someone who's no longer sure he exists within it. 15 seconds. 1966. Imagine waking up in a body that isn't yours with the promise that this one will finally make you happy. Seconds begins with that offer. A new identity sculpted to perfection, delivered by an organization that specializes in starting lives over. The procedure is elegant, the transition seamless, and yet something goes wrong, not in the surgery, but in the soul. The man who emerges isn't a blank slate. He's a man split between who he was and who he's expected to become. The sci-fi here isn't in the gadgets, it's in the concept, reinvention as industry, identity as commodity. Paramount knew this was speculative material, but they pushed the film as psychological drama. There were no flying cars or robots, and that was reason enough to bury the science fiction label. But beneath the surface lies a chilling thought experiment. What happens when the self becomes editable? Today, Seconds reads like a reflection of our era, where lives are curated, bodies redesigned, and identity sold like a service. It wasn't marketed as sci-fi, but it understood the future long before the future understood itself. Bonus fact: until the end of the world, 1991. It begins as a chase, across borders, across languages, a woman entangled in something she doesn't yet understand. But as Until the End of the World stretches out through cities, satellites, and silence, it becomes something else. A prophecy in slow motion. The machine at the center of it all can record what you see, and eventually, what you dream, not as metaphor but as data. Suddenly, memory is portable. Personal vision becomes currency, and the more people revisit their recorded selves, the more they lose interest in the real world. The film was too big, too strange, too early. The studio trimmed it, reframed it, and tried to sell it as a wandering love story. The sci-fi core was buried under travel posters and soundtrack credits. But the full version, rarely screened, quietly passed around, reveals the truth. This wasn't fiction, it was design. It foresaw the isolation of screens, the gravity of self-curation, the prison of infinite playback. In the end, no one needed to ban this film. It disappeared on its own, into the very future it warned us about. Not every disappearance is an accident. Some films are hidden in plain sight, not because they failed, but because they told the truth before the world was ready to hear it. Genre can be a disguise, but it can also be a lock. And when science fiction dares to drift beyond lasers and spaceships into memory, perception, identity, it often gets relabeled, repackaged, made safer, until the message is blurred enough to ignore. But these stories remember what they are, and now, so do we. 15 films that were never truly lost, only mislabeled. So here's the question. Which of these stories do you think was never meant to be called science fiction? And which one feels more real now than ever before?